Hi, my name is John. I created this verse by verse scripture commentary for those who would like to thoughtfully expand their study of the scriptures beyond basic gospel principles. I think this could be particularly helpful for teachers who would like to find a way to more meaningfully engage with their students and with the text. And I've certainly designed this to move from a milk-based diet that the Apostle Paul talks about and warns against beyond initial conversion, and towards a more meat-based diet that requires more thoughtful chewing, swallowing, and digesting of the Word of God. Welcome, and we are in Genesis chapter 4. We've gotten through the Cain and Abel narrative and also the curses and judgments upon Cain narrative. We are now at verse 16, where we are about to see this progression of Cain moving further away from the Lord and kind of the consequences of what that all leads to. We just jump right in with the text, starting in verse 16. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. We've talked about all of these concepts before, but just a refresher. From the presence of the Lord, the original Hebrew literally says from the face of the Lord. We've talked about this, these Hebrew idioms where, for example, you see face being lifted meant you were gaining favor. That could be favor in your community, it could be favor in your family, could be favor before a divine being. And then the opposite is true of face fallen or countenance fallen. It means you are out of favor, you are in some kind of alienation. And the same is true of the Lord's face. If the Lord's face is upon you, or maybe shining upon you or looking upon someone, this would imply some kind of divine presence in the person's life, or perhaps a special kind of divine access. And the opposite is true as well. If you are hid from the face of the Lord, or you are sent out away from the face of the Lord, when Cain repeats his curse back to the Lord, he says, "It's too much for me to bear. I will be hidden from the Lord's face." This means you have no access, no presence of God. No presence of God. And this makes sense because Cain is demonstrating a departure further away from where even Adam and Eve fell. So you have Adam and Eve sinned, they were exiled east of the garden. Remember, all of our temple entrances, well, the original temple entrances and a lot of the early Latter-day Saint temple entrances, they face east. Why is that? Because when you enter the temple, you are coming back. It's a symbol of coming back towards or closer to the presence of God. So they're exiled. They have Cain and Abel. So Cain has only ever known exile east of the Garden of Eden, right? And now Cain, he has sinned. He is being exiled east of the land of Eden. Not just the garden, but the land itself. Into the land of Nod, which literally means the land of wandering. It mirrors his curse, that he would be a wandering kind of vagabond, fugitive, that is to say, this very unstable, nomadic, homeless guy who is going to live in constant anxiety. So we covered that in previous videos, but they're reiterated here in verse 16. And remember that this is not just a physical exile, but because he is being prohibited from having any access to God. Remember in the Garden of Eden, they had unfettered access to God. Outside of the Garden of Eden, they have limited access to God. Well, now Cain has no access to God. He is being spiritually exiled. So, and this is theologically the concept of hell being the absence of where God is. Whatever anyone's version of hell looks like, that idea of being separated from the presence of God is a constant. Several videos ago, we engaged in a brief discussion about LDS lore, I guess you could categorize it, or tradition, that the Garden of Eden was in Jackson County, Missouri. We talked a little bit about how and why Joseph Smith may have come up with that idea and started teaching that. It was said at one point that after Adam and Eve were exiled from the Garden of Eden, that they dwelt in or around the region of Adam-on-Diamond, which is like northeast of Kansas City. We kind of talked about the nuances of that, and I don't think that needs to be taken literally whatsoever. But it was a nice idea, and kind of centered the focus around Zion and a return to kind of where it all began. Something that I just found funny as I was studying this and wanted to share, mostly because it's not so much insightful as much as it made me smile. But if you look up on a map Adam-on-Diamond, Missouri, and you go like 20 miles straight east, imagining that this is maybe where Cain went straight east, there is a tiny little unincorporated town called Farmersville, which is very funny because Cain was a tiller of the ground. He was a farmer, an agrarian, but obviously just a fun coincidence. Verse 17, and Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch. And he builded a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. We have talked about the biblical euphemism of knowing. It was kind of a play on words, right? When Adam and Eve partook of the tree of knowledge, this word meaning this experiential kind of knowledge, to know the good and the evil, but to experience it for yourself. Or in other words, you're not going to be able to know the fullness of XYZ until you experience it for yourself. And then right after they are expelled, after having partaken of the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, then Adam knew his wife Eve, meaning he's having sexual relations with her, and then she conceives and bears a son. And so those ideas are connected, but this is just a Hebrew euphemism for sex. Now the question is, where did Cain get his wife? I think that's a very common question that people have when they read through this section in Genesis. Um, Genesis kind of assumes a broader human population. We talked a little bit about how Cain was worried that someone who found him once he was in his exile state would murder him. And that, yeah, it kind of begs the question, like, who's out there going to kill Cain? If you think that this is a literal human history, and that Adam and Eve and Cain now are the only people on the planet, um, who's coming after him? Well, the book of Genesis is, I think, assuming a broader human population. It also never says that God didn't create other people, or that necessarily there weren't other civilizations outside of the Garden of Eden already. I think the important part to note is that Adam and Eve are just kind of archetypal ancestors. They're not necessarily the only people alive. Now, in a hyper literal interpretation, if you are seeing this as literal history, and that this is a population count, right? Adam, Eve, Cain, and that's it. Now that Abel's dead, then the only answer to Cain's wife is really one of two things. Either God made her in a similar way that maybe he made Adam from the dust of the ground, or made Eve from the rib of Adam. Or the second option is incest, that she would be a sister or even a niece. We teased the idea that maybe Abel had children. Um, if he married his niece, that would have even greater implications for the murder narrative, but I will digress. Some people are grossed out by this idea. It's just important to note that incest law was not codified until Leviticus. This is where you start to have specific marital codes, marital and just sex conduct codes. We've talked a little bit about the documentary hypothesis and how it's pretty clear when scholars examine the book of Genesis that this is probably a bunch of traditions from multiple sources kind of pieced together. What's interesting about that is that Cain and Abel probably come from an older narrative, some kind of older tradition than the story of Adam and Eve. And so when they combined these stories in an attempt to create a congruent narrative to harmonize them, there are some things that just can't be fully harmonized. So Cain's wife kind of acts as this seam that connects two different traditions, and it can't be fully ironed out. It's like the visible stitching between two narratives. So this idea of Cain's wife might be a remnant from some other story that's even much older. Also worth mentioning, I think, that Cain's wife is the second woman mentioned in the Bible, and it begins this pattern of women kind of being marginalized because she's not identified. And throughout the Bible, you will find, I think, throughout Scripture, perhaps in general, that wives or women are really not identified unless they are relevant in one or more of three categories: theologically relevant, politically relevant, or relevant in terms of lineage. Usually that they give birth to someone important, or they give birth to someone who gives birth to someone who gives birth to someone important, right? So they're going to perhaps name women that are in the line of important people. This is also perhaps, this lineage piece, also why polygamous wives are generally named, because it was important to trace who was descended from who. If a person only has one wife, it's not really that confusing. There's not need for a conversation there. Cain's wife gives birth to Enoch. I think accurately pronounced Enoch, but I use them interchangeably. Enoch is a word that essentially means dedicated. Remember how I mentioned before that names that pop up, Hebrew names that pop up in the Bible, typically have to do with the circumstances of the conception or the birth or something like that. This is not an exception to that. Enoch is meaning dedicated, because when Cain builds his first city, he names it after Enoch, meaning he dedicates it to him. Names in the Bible really are that simple. It kind of brings to mind an old joke. I don't know if you've heard this one, where it's like the parents name whatever the first thing falls on the kid's head. So the girl says, "Dad, why am I named Penny?" Oh, when you were little, a little penny dropped in your head. Have you heard this joke? "Oh, Dad, why am I named Daisy?" "Oh, and when you were a baby, a daisy fell in your head." And then the punchline is that the son walks in and he kind of talks funny, and he's, "Hi, Cinderblock." In ancient Near Eastern cultures, and certainly in biblical cultures, it really is that simple. It just has to do with something significant around the circumstances of the conception, the birth, or perhaps even when that child is young. Okay, this is the list that you find from Genesis chapter 4, verse 18 through 22. I'm just going to go ahead and read through it real quick just to say we did. And unto Enoch was born Irad, and Irad begat Mehujael, and Mehujael begat Methusael, and Methusael begat Lamech. And Lamech took unto him two wives, and the name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other was Zillah. And Ada bore Jabal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents, and of such as have cattle. And his brother's name was Jubal, and he was the father of all such as handle the harp and organ. And Zillah, she also bare Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. I do recognize that a lot of people tend to skip over the genealogy sections just because they seem a little monotonous and perhaps not very interesting. I do want to challenge that in this case, at least. This is the line of Cain, and remember, the point of the story, the point of Cain's story, is to kind of explain how these nomadic wandering tribes began, how cities started being built, because remember, Cain is seen as the first city builder. And also, this is going to mirror kind of the image of as civilization increases, people get further away from God. I look at the meanings of all of these names. Now, I want to be really clear when you're reading a genealogy and you see a list of names, I don't think it's necessarily a proper interpretation to look at the meaning of all of the names and then try to piece together some sort of hidden message or code or some kind of even literary message that would be there. But there are themes. I think it's important to look at themes because the story is progressing in a particular way, and I think these names do support that narrative a little bit at least. Irad, this is an unknown meaning. It's at least it's unknown. No one knows for sure. Could mean runner. Could mean wild donkey. Mehujael means smitten by God, or possibly blotted out by God. Methusael is also unknown. Some interpret it as man of God. Another equally appropriate interpretation, death of God. Lamech is also unknown, could be powerful, something to do with strength. Could also, because of one of the root words, mean despair or despairing. Ada, one of Lamech's wives, means adornment or some kind of ornament. Zillah means shadow. Sometimes the way that that word is used could be like a protection. It could also mean obscurity, like hiding in the shadows, perhaps. Jabal, to bring, to carry, to lead. This is significant because he is the father, explicitly stated, as the father of the nomadic herdsman. He's like the Abel of Cain's line. His brother, Jubal, as perhaps in Jubilee, it means stream, or it could be a flowing sound like a stream. He's described as the father of music. Again, this is a type of ideological narrative or an ideological genealogy list. It's trying to describe why things are the way they are and where things came from. Tubal-Cain can mean flowing or productive. That's the tubal part. We already know Cain means to acquire. Perhaps shares some kind of root word that means smith, like a metalsmith or a blacksmith. And this makes sense because he is explicitly described as the father of metalworks, every kind of item of iron and brass. This would also mean, I think, imply weapons. People are learning how to make weapons now. And Nama, perhaps the least ominous name on the list, pleasant, lovely, or sweet. Isn't that nice? So if you look at this list, I do think you will see some themes. You will notice some things pop out. I'm trying to be very transparent about the things that just really aren't known, but you can start to piece together perhaps some commonality. And the through line, I think, is that, or at least what's being expressed here, the further away from God and the closer to big culture items is somehow a progression toward darkness, toward violence, and perhaps even toward judgment. So this kind of encompasses the chaotic nature of what the LDS temple endowment ceremony would refer to as the lone and dreary world. It's kind of every man for himself, and civilization is growing, but also there are some ominous things that are growing as well. This is a very deeply rooted religious archetype, and that is cultural anxiety. There's been this fear with religious people for as far back as you can go that the greater the civilization, the bigger the advancements, that further humans are going to get from God. It's this fear that creativity outside of God is inherently dangerous. Um, and it made me think, when did Western Christianity really begin struggling with this, the reconciliation between divine providence and human progress? Where do you see that really pop up in history? And I would argue it was in the Industrial Revolution. Wherever technology or social change starts to threaten an established order, Christians seem to interpret that through a couple of lenses. The first is apocalyptic. It's this idea that this must be a sign of the end of days. The second is general moral panic. People are going to lose sight of what's good and what's evil, and people are going to confuse good and evil, and it's all going to fall apart. This has been demonstrated. This type of behavior has been demonstrated in every century since the Industrial Revolution. And I look at some of these items and I smile and I chuckle because most of them are innocuous to us today. Most of them are completely innocuous to even the most devout Orthodox religious person. Maybe this is a little bit long-winded, but I do find it interesting to look back at history, at recent history, and kind of look at the parallels of those things. And then you go right back here to Genesis chapter 4. And it's like, this has been the fear from the very beginning. This is what drives pushback, religious pushback, is fear. And I think it's important to acknowledge, this is one of my favorite verses. I quote it a lot. God has not given us a spirit of fear. He's given us a spirit of love, a spirit of power, and a spirit of sound mind. And I want to point out what is, to me, a deep irony that starts to pop up in the Bible. Because in the Bible, closeness to God actually increases accountability. It does not give you exemptions from accountability. And you will find sin and violence and perversion in small pastoral desert dwelling societies such as the Israelites, um, just as much as you would in a big city or a big civilization. And God does not excuse it just because they aren't attached to the big city or the outsiders or the pagans. I know those in my circles who kind of exude this arrogant elitism because we like to think we're chosen, and maybe we are, but In many instances, God judges the chosen much more severely, precisely because they claim his name. Amos chapter 3, verse 2, you only have I known of all the families of the earth, therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities. Being part of a covenant people is not protection from judgment. It is, in my opinion, perhaps greater exposure to it. Remember in Deuteronomy chapter 9, when Moses is kind of rehearsing the history of the Israelites to the Israelites. And there's a set of verses in there that really drive this point home. The Lord is saying, don't ever think you've been brought to this promised land because of something you did right. He says, if anything, it was because your enemies were more wicked than you, but you are a stiff-necked people. Very interesting language there. And many prophets that are sent to Israel later do end up echoing those themes, and they'll even say, you are worse than the nations that you despise. You are worse than these big civilizations that you say are so far from God. Your hearts are also so far from God. In that way, I do think that the nation of Israel begins to exemplify in Scripture some of the worst qualities of pious people who feel that they are elite. It is this they're almost becoming their own worst enemy because they either feel justified in poor behavior because they're chosen, or they feel that they're free from judgment in some way, shape, or form. It does remind me a little bit of just the irony of this. I did door-to-door sales for a while, and I'll tell you, I mean, obviously nobody likes a door-to-door salesman. It's tough work. You have to dig rejection, but without fail, the worst ones, the ones that you knew were going to be nasty and were going to yell at you and were just going to be generally not nice. Can you guess?
I'll go two guesses. Either the no soliciting signs, in which case you should really
Oh
bother.
yeah, I don't bother no soliciting signs.
Or the ones with a bunch of Jesus stuff on their door.
Yep, the ones with crosses, the ones with Bible verses. If you see as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, you're bracing. And you could bet on it. You know what the nicest ones were? Pride flags.
I can see that.
Anywhere with a pride flag, they may tell you they're not interested, but yeah, every time you could bet on it that the nastiest ones were the ones with scripture and crosses, and the nicest ones were maybe the ones that get demonized the most. I could have bet on that every time and made a lot of money. Um, my question, I guess, in light of this is, what reputation do we have as Latter-day Saints? Do we have a good reputation, or do we have a bad reputation? And I'm not talking about just general conference. I'm not talking about what you hear at church, because you're going to hear a very polished narrative about your own group within your bubble. And especially if it's front public facing stuff like general conference. I mean, boots to the ground, real world interaction outside of your bubble reputation. Is it good or bad? Are we known as humble people because we believe in continual revelation? And that means that we can be wrong about a lot of stuff that the Lord has yet to reveal to us. Or are we prideful because we treat our access to continual revelation as something special that we have and nobody else does? Are we exemplifying service because we have the priesthood, which we describe as God's power on earth? Do we use that power to serve others, or do we use it to sort of lord this status of priesthood over others and demonize other priesthoods even for being false? Are we loving because we have a God that first loved us? Or are we quick to jump onto social bandwagons and demonize people who are different from us? Are we forgiving because we have been forgiven, because we believe in an infinite atonement and an infinite forgiveness? Or are we quick to demonize those who have slighted us or hurt us or left our community? Um, my metric is that I tend to be less concerned about, say, what my local leadership thinks about me than I am about what my loved ones who have left the church think about me. That's the real litmus test because uh, I have nothing to gain from that. Am I kind, compassionate, understanding, nurturing, even when there's no social advantage for me? And when you start to see this kind of stuff, I do find it deeply ironic because this is polemic. It's polemic in tone, it's polemic in nature, narratively, to say that, oh, the bigger the civilization and all these basically evil city people who are far away from God, descendants of evil people, they're all evil people, all their art and culture and weapons and all this stuff. We have the truth, we're the chosen ones. Israel's in for a rude awakening because the Lord is going to often hold them to a much higher standard. I want to have a brief discussion about Old Testament biblical polygamy based on verse 19 of chapter 4 here, because this is the first time we see a polygamous marriage. Polygamy, specifically polygyny, meaning one man, multiple wives, was a normal, socially regulated institution in ancient Near Eastern cultures, and you will find it all over Mesopotamian writings. You'll find law codes, marriage contracts, royal inscriptions, and really, I mean, there's several purposes for why it happened culturally. First, I would say economically, it made sense because the more wives you had, the more children you had, meaning the more labor you had, meaning a more secure lineage. The larger your tribe, the better it was for you in that world. There was also a high female mortality rate in childbirth. You also had war, just lots of constant war. I tell people all the time, and people say, look around at this terrible world. Aren't we in the end days, the last days? We are living in the most peaceful time in human history that history has ever seen. Back in this day, you would just have war constantly, and war killed men disproportionately. So you had more women than men. Also, to top that off with just general, very low life expectancy. And really, a combination of these three things and that social factor, it just destabilized even the concept of monogamy. Ironically, cities, wealth, and culture, it tends to stabilize monogamy. It does the opposite. Um, and everyone knows this. Brigham Young knew this. And I think, in a way, it's why he demonized the Roman Empire, one of the greatest civilizations of all time, for the evil of monogamy. The other important thing to note is that this was really only common with elites because you had to have enough money and enough resources to be able to provide for multiple women and their children. And so, if you didn't have a lot of money, if you didn't have a lot of property, if you didn't have a lot of resources, a lot of food, or livestock, or servants, this really, the polygamy stuff just wouldn't work out at all. So in many ways, this started to act as, in the ancient world, as a social status. It was a marker of being elite. If you had a lot of wives, it meant you were wealthy. The Hebrew Bible does not mandate polygamy. It does not condemn polygamy either. It assumes polygamy's existence in those cultures. It regulates it specifically with regard to inheritance and just general marital law, marital rights, and some social justice. The the first instance of polygamy here with Lamech, first biblical polygamist. In the instance of Lamech, his polygamy, as it is depicted in the Bible, not particularly evil. There's no condemnation. I will say that it is portrayed alongside of this polemic narrative of distance from God and people getting further away from God. And in fact, throughout the Bible, every polygamous household that I am aware of mentioned in the Bible is depicted as very unstable. So there are favoritism issues, there are rivalries between wives, there's some unchecked power in some instances with polygamous men. But in the ancient Near Eastern world, polygamy in general, it's complicated. It's morally neutral. It's functionally good, socially messy, socially problematic. Now, from a reproductive standpoint, just biologically speaking, polygamy kind of makes sense because one man could populate a whole planet, basically. Women are the reproductive bottleneck. But this is why polygamy tends to show up at certain times in history. It shows up in the frontier eras. It shows up post-war very heavily, and in high mortality societies as well. It just tends to pop up. If you think about that from a biological perspective, it's very interesting because that kind of makes monogamy a sort of social technology because it's not necessarily a biological instinct. And so, what does this technology do? It reduces male competition, it reduces violence. It starts to be linked to property rights. You get that in the Bible. It starts to be a way of like paternal certainty because this was the age before paternity tests. So if you're monogamous, you know who your children are in theory. Also, there's this social leveling. So there's no longer these elites, and also perhaps some social leveling between men and women, or giving women a little bit more equal standing in some way. All right. I'd like to have this conversation. I'll try to make it as brief as possible, but I do think it warrants a discussion because a lot of people will look at a verse like Genesis 4:19. They'll look at other instances in the Bible where polygamy is not condemned, perhaps even polygamy sanctioned or regulated in some way, and then they will say, "Well, that is justification and a good rationalization for why polygamy would have showed up in the Nauvoo era under the umbrella of the restoration of all things." So, in fairness, I would just like to compare the two, and particularly as it concerns Levitical law relating to how polygamy was regulated among the Israelites. We will start with Leviticus 18:18. This was one of the laws that forbade sister pairs, at least while one of them was, or at least while both of them were alive. You were not allowed to be married to two sisters simultaneously. If you were married to one and then she died, that you could marry her sister, that's fine. But you cannot marry them simultaneously. If you did, the penalty would be cutting off otherwise known as exile. Exile from the covenantal community. Leviticus 18, actually, this is one verse earlier. 18:17 forbids mother-daughter pairs, because this is branched under incest law, basically. I guess this would be too. The penalty for this would be death. Leviticus 18:20 and also 20:10. This is an umbrella, or under the umbrella of adultery. Remember that adultery was always based on the woman's status, because the woman was the property of her father or the property of her husband. So, under the umbrella of adultery would be polyandry. You are not allowed to marry someone who is already married or someone who is already betrothed or engaged to someone else. The penalty for this would also be death. Deuteronomy 22 and Exodus 22 talk about how the father of the woman essentially needs to be involved. His father's consent. I think there's also an argument to be made in these chapters that it is also community consent. In other words, it would there if you were to perform a secret marriage of any kind, that would be against the law, and the penalty for this would be at least a fine. It kind of was up to the father or whoever's, yeah, because he would be the property owner. And then Leviticus 18:6 through 7 would be daughters. You are not allowed to marry your daughters. This would include daughters under authority. Um, Meaning anybody that you had legal responsibility for. I think every rabbinic midrashic tradition and interpretation that I'm aware of would include like adoption under that umbrella. There weren't too many adoption laws in Levitical law, but it would certainly fall under daughters under authority. The penalty for this would be death. Let's take a look at Nauvoo era polygamy, particularly as it was practiced by Joseph Smith. We know that Joseph Smith was married to Emily and Eliza Maria Partridge, the Partridge sisters. He was also married to Maria and Sarah Lawrence. By the way, if you have any questions about was he, was he married to them or not, you can actually look up his family search record, and you can see a list of all of the women that he was married to. There were rumors, I'll put this in a different color because it's not confirmed. There were some rumors or claims that he was married to the Johnson sisters, Huntington sisters, and Snow sisters. Very mixed reports, most likely not. He was married to one of each of these, but not really confirmed that he was married to sisters. Keep in mind, a lot of Nauvoo era polygamy was not well documented because it was very secretive. So the documents that we do have, and I'll get into that a little bit, are very certain, and the church acknowledges like pretty much all of it. But some of it's missing, some of it's very spacey. We know that he was married to Patty Bartlett Sessions and Sylvia Porter Sessions Lyon, a mother and a daughter pair. There was some rumor or claim that he had possibly married Clarissa Alger, the mother of Fanny Alger. That is not confirmed. We know that Joseph Smith married Zena Huntington Jacobs, Marinda Johnson Hyde, Sylvia Porter Sessions Lyon, Patty Bartlett Sessions, Elizabeth Davis Goldsmith, Mary Elizabeth Rollins Leitner, and Sarah Ann Whitney. 6 of these 7 women were married, and 1 was engaged. 1 was pregnant, actually. Yes, ma'am.
I just, because I'd heard rumor of this growing up in the church that
Mhm.
he was married. They say in spirit only,
Mhm.
no physical intimacy
Mhm.
to some of these women. And I always just assumed that, if it was in the temple just for their spirits, then maybe it was, like because their husband wasn't a member and it was to save their souls or something. But I found out these women, many of them were married while their husband was on a mission that Joseph sent them on for the church.
There's at least 1 instance of that. Not all of them, but my understanding is that a lot of these women were married to faithful members. Whether they were out on mission or not, I don't know that that can be proven. There is 1 documented instance of that. Mm-hmm. Thank you. We know that at least 7 single women did not have father's consent because, no father's consent. Arguably not theirs either, but we'll get into that. Not no father's consent because the fathers didn't know about it. Pretty much every single woman, every single, meaning not married, woman, except for Sarah Ann Whitney, well documented that her father knew. And then the Lawrence girls, Maria and Sarah Lawrence, they were Joseph's adopted daughters. They wouldn't have called them that back in the day. That's what we would call them today. They were his wards. He took them in after their father died when they were like 12 and 14, and then married them when they were 17 and 19. Presumably, Emma knew about that one, because I think they were all living together at the time. But indeed, were his adopted daughters for all intents and purposes. Yes, ma'am.
Would Fanny Alger count as a daughter under the authority if she was a maid?
No, no. Fanny would not have counted. She was a live-in maid. Uh, no, no records of her being.
But she was under his protection, or would have supposedly.
I don't think it would have. She would have counted more as a servant,
Okay.
or even a slave back in the biblical times. But no, I don't think she would have counted as a daughter under authority. Good question, though. I also do think it's worth mentioning here about the Levitical Holiness Code. This was not civil marriage law, but you can find some of this in Leviticus 19. Call it the Holiness Code. Leviticus 19, Deuteronomy 13, and Numbers 25. Don't have enough space, and I kind of want to keep this stuff on the board for now, so I'll just kind of read you a summary of these things. Leviticus 19 essentially said that sexual access cannot be justified by any social or religious authority. Deuteronomy 13 talks about going after other gods. This was particularly in reference to pagan practices where there were like sexualized religious practices. It was one of the most primary markers of apostate cults in the Bible. And essentially, Deuteronomy 13 says no revelation can suspend covenantal law. It says if there is a prophet that comes up to you and says, hey, covenantal law is now suspended because God has given me a new revelation, you are to ignore that prophet and you are to kill him. Numbers 25 talks about ritualized sexual religious integration. Basically, Israel gets involved with this Moabite sex cult, and there's a plague that kills 24,000 people. There's a zealot that kills an Israelite man having sex with a Moabite woman. It's gruesome, bloody. These were offenses that if you broke this holiness code, it was absolutely punishable by death. Not just by your legal system, but they believed that God would come in and strike you dead. Moving over to Nauvoo era polygamy, what do we know that Joseph said to women and families? That this was commanded, that this was necessary, that this was a divine test of obedience. He gave Doctrine and Covenants 132, which says refusal equals some kind of danger, whether they will be destroyed physically or spiritually. We have records of Joseph mentioning angelic threats, that an angel appeared to him with a flaming sword and that he or someone else was going to be struck down if polygamy was not practiced. There were oaths of secrecy. And indeed, he kept this secret from his wife. Emma was, I think, the 22nd or the 23rd wife that was sealed to Joseph, not anywhere near the first. This was also kept a secret from church members, most church members, and the public, of course. In this instance, Joseph had total power, and he treated this as a divine restoration. Yes, ma'am.
So, I forget. I remember in like earlier versions of the endowment ceremony, there was, like actual touching of body parts and stuff.
Yes.
With the sealing ceremony, I forget, did they actually consummate physically in the temple? I heard that, but I'm not
There
sure
are no, there, as far as I know, there are no corroborated records or accounts outside of very polemic and I would say anti sources that say there were any sexual activities happening in the temple. I'm not aware of that. Good question. Okay, obviously, you guys can see the point I'm trying to make. I hope you can see the point I'm trying to make, but I will maybe spell it out for you. I am not in any way trying to be disrespectful. I know some people will feel differently about this because this is a sensitive topic. I am trying to be honest. And I am willing to say that polygamy was revealed with caveats. I am less willing to say that it was restored. Because in what meaningful way was any of this a restoration of this? For this to be a restoration, it has to look like the original thing. Now, I am willing to say that perhaps Joseph Smith thought that he was restoring polygamy as part of the restoration of all things, predicated on the reality that he didn't know anything about Mosaic law, or he knew and didn't care, but that's harder for me to defend if he's the Lord's prophet. The point of which being, and I think I said it before I wrote all this out, a lot of people point to biblical polygamy as a justification for Nauvoo polygamy. And this is one of the painful parts of needing to be apologetically literate and apologetically honest. biblical polygamy and Nauvoo polygamy aren't remotely the same thing. Not even close. Now, I know there are some people out there who are polygamy deniers. I don't know if there's an appropriate term for that community. I don't know if polygamy denier is like a negative thing. Um, and I don't have any beef with polygamy deniers. I just don't get it. In the same way that I know there are people out there who genuinely, unironically believe the earth is flat. I don't have any beef with them. I just don't get it. You have to reject every major category of evidence. You have to reject affidavits from his wives. You have to reject letters in his own handwriting. You have to reject independent witness accounts from clerks and from apostles. You have to reject sworn testimony from his inner circle. You have to reject Doctrine and Covenants 132. You have to say either he revealed or he received this revelation that he actually didn't practice, or that someone forged it after the fact. That Brigham Young maybe took it and said Joseph told him, or Joseph had revealed it, and then no one in the Nauvoo inner circle ever said, "Hey, we never heard anything about that." You have to reject basically the reality that during the last days of Joseph's life, when all of this was coming to a head, all of his enemies accidentally told the truth about the inner circle of polygamy, while all of Joseph's friends were lying about polygamy. So convoluted and so messy. You have to ignore the fact, reject the fact that four prophets, four presidents of the church after Joseph Smith, um, who knew Joseph personally. They practiced polygamy. They said they learned it from him. Brigham Young, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, Lorenzo Snow. These are not fringe leaders, obviously. These are leaders of the church, prophets of God. And they said they learned it in Nauvoo because they were there when all of this was happening. You have to reject the fact, this is harder to do, I think, if you're a member of the church, perhaps. You have to reject the fact that the church accepts this, all of this, and is much more transparent about it now in the last 5 to 10 years than they ever have been. They accept and teach that Joseph Smith did, in fact, institute plural marriage. Look, I love sitting in the nuance. It is often a very lonely place. In this case, if you are being intellectually honest, you have to accept two things. Number one, Joseph Smith absolutely practiced polygamy. And number two, Nauvoo polygamy doesn't look anything like biblical polygamy. Those are two things that I think, if you're being honest, you have to accept. I want to turn to John chapter 8. This is an instance where Jesus is teaching religious leaders. He's being very cryptic in the chapter, almost riddle-like. It's actually kind of hard to read. But he starts to get through to some of these religious leaders, and the text explicitly says some of them start to believe in him. And then he addresses those who are particularly believing on his words. And he says this in verses 31 to 32. Then said Jesus to those Jews which believed on him, If ye continue in my word, then are ye my disciples indeed, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. This progresses into kind of a debate between these Jewish folks and Jesus. And these people are saying, what do you mean the truth will set us free? We're not in bondage. They say, we are Abraham's seed. We are free. And it progresses to the point of Jesus saying, if you were Abraham's children, you would do the works of Abraham. I really like this phrase that he says, if you continue in my word. This word continue, meno in the Greek. It means endurance at all costs. Endurance even when it's costly, even when it hurts. When Jesus says, if you continue, if you endure even when it hurts, in my word, you shall know the truth, The truth shall set you free. This freedom is not relief from tension. This freedom is it's a freedom from delusion. It's a freedom from self-deception. These Jews proclaim to Jesus, we are already free. They don't even want to examine it. They've put a shield up against any self-examination, and that is not a marker of discipleship. Keep in mind, these are the ones who already believe, and they're immediately getting defensive. Their belief in Jesus is not the issue. They want to avoid a reckoning. Brothers and sisters, being intellectually honest is not anti-LDS. Being intellectually honest is not anti-faith. If biblical polygamy was Nauvoo polygamy, or rather, if Nauvoo polygamy was a restoration of biblical polygamy, it would look like biblical polygamy. Or in the words of Jesus, if you were Abraham's children, you would do the works of Abraham. Christ says lineage does not excuse behavior. Sacred precedent does not sanctify any present action. And to say it does means you are in bondage. You are a slave to a narrative. You are a slave to institutional loyalty. You are a slave to fear. Now, let me be clear about this. Jesus does not say that the truth will protect your community standing. Jesus does not say that the truth will preserve your idea of authority structures. Jesus does not say that the truth will keep your belief painless. He said it will set you free. It will set you free from having to lie for God. It will set you free from calling moral discomfort anti-Mormon or anti-faith. It will set you free from the idea that God needs us to somehow blur reality to defend him. I'll tell you this, and this is as blunt as I can put it when we're talking about this subject matter. If your faith can only survive by insisting that Nauvoo polygamy and biblical polygamy are basically the same, that faith is not abiding in truth. That faith is abiding in fear. And God has not given us a spirit of fear. He has given us a spirit of love and of power and of sound mind. When you imply that people are in bondage to a narrative or to an institution, they don't tend to like it. I get that. They didn't like it when Jesus did it either. In fact, that chapter ends with them picking up stones and trying to kill him. As I said, for me, nuance is a great place, but it is often lonely. And I want you to know that even if you feel lonely, because I know there are a lot of people who do want to be intellectually honest about this, and I promise you, even if you feel lonely, you are not alone. You are in very, very good company. This is tough subject matter, but I appreciate you reviewing it with me. And I will leave these things with you in the name of Jesus Christ.